Hi, everyone. Welcome. Thank you for joining us for our Aspire study report launch. The report is named Still Overqualified and Underemployed, where it discusses Canadian Muslim women's experiences of employment barriers and facilitators. For those of you who may not be familiar with the term Aspire, it stands for Addressing Systemic Problems and Inequities in Resolving Employment Issues. I will start off by a land acknowledgement. I reside from the region of Peel. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the land on which we gather, and which the region of Peel operates, as part of the treaty lands and territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit. For thousands of years, Indigenous peoples inhabited and cared for this land and continue to do so today. In particular, we acknowledge the territory of the Anishinaabe, the Huron-Wendat, the Haudenosaunee, and Ojibwe Chippewa peoples, the land that is home to the Métis, and most recently the territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit, First Nations, who are direct descendants of the Mississaugas of the Credit. We are grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land, and by doing so, give our respect to its first inhabitants. I'd now like to pass it off to our Executive Director, Nusrat Jaffrey at CCMW.
Thank you, Zulekha, and welcome everyone to our study launch for the Aspire project. Just to go over the agenda briefly. So you just heard from Zulekha. She did our welcome remarks and land acknowledgement. And then I'll provide you with some other comments and introduce you to Isabelle Lauzon, our Senior Program Officer, who will share some remarks. And then Iman Ahmed Noor is going to tell you a little bit more about our Project Aspire. And of course, the pièce de résistance today, a presentation by Dr. Sarah Shah on the study she's done on Canadian Muslim women or from Canadian Muslim women and employers. And then we'll open it up to Q&A, and then Nina Karachi Khalid will provide some closing remarks. So all in all, we should be done by 2:30. Our project includes myself, Nusrat Jaffrey, our lead researcher investigator, Dr. Sarah Shah, and she is doing this work while she's with Muslims in Canada Data Initiative at the Institute of Islamic Studies at the University of Toronto. Firdaus Ali, who is the project manager for this particular project and many others, and Iman Ahmed Noor, who is our digital communications coordinator and keeps ourselves very present in the in social media platforms across the world. And then finally, you just heard from Zulekha Hirsi. This team has been working tirelessly to bring this phase of the project to you. So please do thank them as we go along. Next slide, please. We're also joined today by Kimia Romeshi, who is our evaluation consultant. Kimia is not a stranger to CCMW. She has been evaluating projects for us since 2019, and she is a really skilled evaluator and a true friend to CCMW. Welcome, Kimia. And we're also joined today by Amal Masri, who's our employment consultant. And hello, Amal. Amal has an amazing background in different private sector organizations. She is an entrepreneur herself, and she has really wide experience when it comes to DEI, especially in the empowerment of racialized women and ensuring that they advance in their lives and their careers. And she's been featured in many different media. And we are so lucky to have her on our team. And she's going to basically be very involved in the next phase of this project. Welcome, Amal. Next slide, please. Another group that I want to really thank from the bottom of my heart. These are our Aspire study research assistants. Without them, we would not have been able to get the input from women, Muslim women who feel more comfortable in other languages other than English and French. And so the facilitators were Kamala Mohammed and Rana Al-Rabi, who facilitated our French focus groups. Anam Kazim and Fatma Khan did the Urdu ones. Fatma Dini and Asha Dahir did the Somali focus groups, and Alina Hadri and Zainab Jamal did the Farsi and Dari, and Frishta Karimi and Zainab Jamal again did the Pashto ones. Sumaya Bahar and Rana Al-Rabi did Arabic, and Silmi Abdullah and Shimona Shafinaz did our Bangla focus group. So without them, we would not have been able to hear the voices of some of the women that are mostly left out of initiatives like this. So we're grateful to them for facilitating those focus groups. Next slide, please. And of course, we couldn't have done this study without our participants. And those participants include diverse Muslim women from across the country and Canadian employers. They participated and they have informed the study that Sarah has now, completed and will be sharing the results of very soon. Next slide, please. We also want to acknowledge the contribution of our Project Advisory Committee. The Project Advisory Committee consists of actually members of different sectors. So the immigrant serving organizations, our own chapter members, employers in different sectors, including the private sector, the public sector. There's quite a variety of, there's academics that are part of our study advisory group, our project advisory group. So we are really grateful. Without their input and their ideas and their suggestions, we would not have been able to complete this. Next slide, please. Now, I am so happy that our Senior Program Officer with Wage, Women and Gender Equality Canada, Isabelle Lauzon, is with us, because it was really Isabelle who helped guide me when I was thinking, how am I going to apply for this project? This is a project that I've been wanting to apply for many years. And in fact, whenever we had the opportunity to apply for a new grant, we ended up selecting other topics other than employment, because there were some pressing issues we were, hoping to address. But finally, thank you, Isabelle, for saying that, yes, it's possible for you to apply for a grant through our continuous intake process. And I did, and the project was approved. And I'm so grateful to Isabelle for her openness, to entertain our proposal. And then, of course, we got approval for it. And Isabelle's been with us now for a few years, and she has been amazing to work with at Wage. So I'm going to pass this along, the mic over to Isabelle, who'll say a few words now. Welcome, Isabelle.
Merci, Nisa. Thank you. I'm blushing. Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to have you join us for this highly anticipated lunch. Imagine a world where your skills, education, and passion are overshadowed by stereotypes and discrimination. This is the daily reality for many Muslim women striving to break barriers in the workforce. Today, it is the launch of the report on the employment barriers faced by Canadian Muslim women, an ambitious and an essential project led by the Canadian Council of Muslim Women. I am Isabelle Lauzon, Senior Program Officer responsible for this project at Women and Gender Equality Canada, and I'm honored to be here to discuss a matter that is crucial for the inclusive growth of our society. This report is supported by our department's commitment to fostering equality and diversity, addresses a pivotal issue that impacts the economic and social fabric of our nation. I want you to meet Noor. She's an accomplished civil engineer who graduated with honors from one of Canada's top universities. Despite her impressive qualifications and a solid portfolio of successful projects, Noor found it difficult to secure employment. During job interviews, instead of discussing her innovative designs and project management skills, interviewers often question her cultural background and how it might affect team dynamics. One hiring manager is even asked, how do you see yourself fitting into our company culture? Noor's experience highlights a disturbing trend. Muslim women face significantly higher unemployment rates compared to their non-Muslim peers, despite having equal or even superior credentials. Consider now the story of Layla, a recent immigrant with a degree in accounting. Layla's qualifications were questioned at every application. Her foreign degrees were deemed insufficient, and she was advised to retake courses and exams, a costly and time-consuming process. Even when she finally found a job, she faced subtle and overt racism from colleagues and clients. Yet, Layla persevered, taking additional courses and earning certifications to prove her worth. For many Muslim women, the path to professional success is fraught with daily challenges. Yet, these women persist. They move forward, driven by their ambitions and the desire to break the stereotypes that seek to limit them. These anecdotes are a stark reminder of the barriers that persist despite our collective efforts to create a fair and just society. Women and Gender Equality Canada has funded this initiative because we recognize the necessity of addressing these systemic challenges head on. The Canadian Council of Muslim Women has done an outstanding job in illuminating these issues through their comprehensive research and dedication. As we unveil these reports' findings, we take a crucial step towards breaking down these barriers. Together, let us make the voices of Canadian Muslim women heard and work towards a more just and equitable world. That's it.
Thank you, Isabel.
Thank you so much, Isabel. That was really great, and we are so grateful for your support. All right, hello everyone. My name is Iman Ahmed Noor. I'm CCMW's Digital Communication Coordinator, and I'll be providing a brief overview of CCMW's Addressing Barriers to Employment for Muslim Women project, also known as the Aspire project, as Suleika mentioned earlier. So this project is a multi-year initiative funded by Wage Canada and is designed to provide a deeper understanding and effective responses to the employment barriers faced by Canadian Muslim women through comprehensive data collection, analysis, and the development of targeted strategies and tools. We aim to engage community partners, employers, and Canadian Muslim women themselves in creating meaningful change. Next slide, please. So we just wanted to take a look at our project goals. First one being understanding barriers. We aim to better understand the specific barriers that Canadian Muslim women face in accessing, sustaining, and advancing their employment. Offering strategies and tools. We will provide practical strategies and tools to both employers and Canadian Muslim women to reduce these employment barriers and foster a more inclusive and supportive work environment. And lastly, influencing public policy. Our efforts will also focus on influencing public policy to address and remove these employment barriers. Next slide. So the project is structured to achieve impactful outcomes over different timeframes. In the short term, establishing networks and collaborations that increase the reach, impact, and sustainability of women's equality efforts. In the medium term, ensuring that our intended audiences are applying the knowledge gained in their policy and program work to address these barriers. And in the long term, creating inclusive policies and practices that effectively address and remove barriers to women's equality in the workforce. And next slide, please. Okay, and this is an overview of our project timelines of key activities and deliverables. So in 2024, we did some quantitative and qualitative data collection and analysis. And this phase involved engaging employers to understand the challenges they faced in recruiting and retaining Muslim women, working with community partners who provided employment services, and collecting experiences from Muslim women themselves. And in 2025, we have a few things coming up. So we will be developing 2 toolkits. The first toolkit will provide employers with strategies and tools to recruit, retain, and develop and promote Muslim women in their workplaces. And the second toolkit will be aimed at Muslim women themselves, offering guidance on accessing employment and advancing their careers. And both toolkits will be available in English and in French. In 2025, we'll also be holding a national employment conference to launch the toolkits and featuring workshops to apply the included strategies and tools. And also from 2025 and onwards, we're going to be offering workshops across Canada for both employers and Canadian Muslim women to further disseminate and apply the knowledge from these toolkits. Next slide. All right, so next I'm going to be passing it over to Sarah to talk a little bit more about the study and the findings. But first, I would like to introduce Sarah. Sarah is an assistant professor of sociology and Gestalt therapist in training. They're the lead researcher at the Muslims in Canada Data Initiative at the Institute of Islamic Studies at the University of Toronto, where they collaborate with national and local Canadian Muslim organizations. Their research focuses on the intersections of religion, racialization, immigration, family and gender relations, and mental health. And before I pass it over to you, Sarah, I just want to mention there will be a Q&A at the end of Sarah's presentation. So if you have any questions as Sarah presents, make sure to drop them in the Q&A section at the bottom bar. There's a little Q&A tab. Make sure you can put your questions in there. You can also put them in the chat. All right, over to you, Sarah.
Thank you so much, Iman, for that introduction and also for the overview of the project. And thank you, everyone, for joining today. I know many of you will be reading the report, and some of you already have. So instead of being redundant and just covering the findings, I'm going to actually provide a composite stories of Canadian Muslim women based on the data, based on the findings from the research. So although the women that I'll be describing today don't exist as like real individuals, their stories and the events that I'm going to describe all come from Canadian Muslim women who participated in this study and also from employers who generously donated their time to the study. Before we get into those the stories though, if we could go to the next slide. I'll share a little bit about Canadian Muslim history. So 2 decades ago, in 2004, Dr. Daoud Hamdani published a report to better understand the experiences of Canadian Muslim women in terms of their social and demographic outcomes as well. So for folks who may not be familiar with Dr. Hamdani, I recommend watching this tribute that was created by the Muslims in Canada Archive, or MICA, at the Institute of Islamic Studies. Dr. Hamdani was a pioneer in studying Muslims in Canada, both statistically and also historically. In his 2004 report, he found that Canadian Muslim women are significantly more educated than the average Canadian, and yet also more likely to report being underemployed or unemployed. Now, 20 years later, in 2024, how have things changed? If they have changed. The short answer is that they have not. And so we continue to see similar rates of Canadian Muslim women overrepresented in entry-level work, so retail and sales positions and other kinds of work that sociologists of work call dirty work. And so if you look at the bottom rung of this workplace hierarchy, you can see it's overrepresented by people of color, especially women of color. These positions tend to not have very good pay or benefits, and employees tend to have no job authority, so no say in company matters. The next level, the middle level, includes professionals and middle management. And so this is work that provides employees with better pay and benefits, and it typically gives employees some authority at work. And these positions tend to be dominated by white women. In the very top rung of this workplace hierarchy, this is senior management or executive positions. And these positions boast the best pay and benefits, and they give employees a great deal of authority at the workplace. These positions tend to be dominated by white men. When I spoke to Muslim women across these 3 levels, I noted that, so of course, there were many more women in the bottom rung of this hierarchy compared to the top rung. Where Muslim women were in this hierarchy shapes how they experience work, especially the kinds of barriers that they are confronted by or the resources that they're able to leverage. In addition to where they land in the workplace, on the next slide, their social identities matter too. So for Amina, her old age and her immigrant status shape her experiences, while Fatima navigates the job market as a second-generation Canadian Muslim woman. Hodan experiences anti-Black racism, and Narjas experiences homophobia. Tanzil is a single mother who's squeezed for time as a member of the sandwich generation. Although their identities are different, their struggles are interconnected. Now, keep in mind that both the workplace hierarchy and women's social identities, because both of these 2 things play a role in shaping women's stories and their experiences. We can start with Amina's story. Next slide, please. So Amina is an immigrant Muslim woman from a South Asian country. Unlike most other immigrant women who are coming to Canada, she came as they tend to come as sponsored immigrants, but Amina came as a skilled worker. And so also, unlike many immigrant Muslim women, her master's degree in biotechnology was recognized when she transferred her credentials as she moved to Canada. Even though her master's degree was recognized, Amina still struggled to find work in her own field for months after moving to Canada. And again, although her credentials were recognized, employers are not familiar with the universities that she attended. And so her degree transferred, but employees didn't necessarily count it. Amina doesn't know this, and she doesn't understand why she's not receiving responses, even as she continues to apply for positions that she is qualified for. And at some point, she lowers her own expectations. So she's applying for positions that she's overqualified for. She uses the employment services at a local community organization, and eventually she does get a position on contract, but has trouble fitting in at work. Her colleagues all get along and they talk about things like going to the Blue Jays game or going to the cabin for the weekend or about hockey or about other aspects of Canadian culture that they don't really relate to her. She doesn't resonate with them. And they also use jargon. So they say things in English, but they seem to mean something very different from what Amna understands. She did go to a British medium school in her home country. She's fluent in English, but her Canadian English it's different. She notices that it's different. She tries her best to fit into the team, and she feels that as an immigrant, it's her responsibility to make that effort, but no one else at her workplace notices that she's making this effort, and no one else reciprocates that effort. So she feels very alone. Eventually, her contract is up and her work has been stellar. Her supervisor has always been very pleased with what she's been doing. She is therefore shocked when she finds out that her contract is not being renewed. When she asks for feedback, she's told that she's not a great fit for the company. She doesn't know what that means, so she asks for additional feedback, and she's discreetly told that the company wants to hire a younger person that they can invest in, not someone who is moving towards retirement. Now, Amina still has over 10 years left before she hits retirement age, and she's very upset by this. She mentions her experience to a friend's daughter, Fatima, at the local masjid. And Fatima says, you know, Amina auntie, you're really good at thinking through these social issues. Why not consider a position that would allow you to explore those skills? Amina gets very interested and asks Fatima for more information. And through Fatima, Amina learns about a certificate program that would allow her to transfer some of her skills into a social service context. She ends up getting a position in middle management thanks to Fatima. Amina gets a job in Fatima's company. Although Amina is new in this company, she already feels a bit isolated from her coworkers, and she feels supported at the same time by people like Fatima at her workplace who do make an effort to make sure that she feels welcome and she feels comfortable. Things are going well, but then she starts to have some health-related concerns. Now, we have this assumption that ability means something very specific, and anything outside of that ability is therefore a disability. And we've essentially made up these ideas. Most of us will experience what we term as disability at some point in our lives, especially as we get older. And these disabilities are often not visible. Can we switch to the next slide? Thank you. So people with hidden disabilities often report a number of different symptoms, and these are true for Amina as well. As her diabetes progresses, in addition to having to use the bathroom more frequently or keeping on top of her blood glucose levels throughout the day, Amina finds that she's experiencing chronic pain and fatigue, and she's also beginning to experience more of an impact on her mental well-being. She finds going into work to be quite a burden on her health. And so she begins to call in sick to work more frequently. Her supervisor notices and calls her into a meeting. Amina is very reluctant to share about her health concerns because of the old age discrimination that she experienced in the past. She's not willing to go through that again. And so she doesn't disclose what's happening for her to the supervisor. The supervisor gets frustrated and knows that Amina and Fatima, they have some kind of friendship. So he turns to Fatima for assistance, and Fatima, being the DEI manager at the workplace, talks to Amina, and she talks her into trusting the supervisor. When Amina shares what's happening with her health to the supervisor actually works with Fatima to create a solution. And they suggest allowing Amina time flexibility and remote work to help support her as she navigates her diverse ability. This solution works really well for Amina, who's happy to continue working and producing with the support of her workplace. So can we move to the next slide? So in terms of barriers that created obstacles for Amina, the fact that her credentials were recognized during immigration, but they weren't recognized on the job market. And so this is an important piece, that even when credentials translate into the Canadian context, they're not always taken with the same weight as Canadian credentials, for example. This is especially the case for immigrants. For Amina, although she spoke English fluently, language still posed a barrier, because it's not just English or French language skills, it's the jargon, it's the social context that language becomes mobilized in. Another aspect for Amina was old age discrimination, and related to that, health concerns and having a hidden disability. In terms of supports that were effective in helping Amina overcome some of these barriers, she did employ the services of an employment services program at a local community organization. She drew on her network. So for example, Fatima, and then having time and location flexibility for being able to work remotely. Those two items were especially supportive for her to continue working through the experience of becoming disabled. If we switch to the next slide. In terms of action items, so these are things that Amina could do, also things that employers could do, and then things that policymakers could do. Some of these things are already in existence. Some of them are missing and could become policies or programs, for example. So for Amina to expand her network and connect with people from diverse backgrounds helped her in order to secure the position that she has. So meeting with Fatima, for example. Seeking out services at local community organizations was also useful in her getting the foot in the door with her first career or first job position in Canada. And then being able to creatively reimagine her career possibilities, which was an invitation issued by Fatima, that worked out for Amina. In terms of what employers could do, part of the issue here is the foreignness of certain credentials. So one of the employers that I spoke to mentioned that when she sees a university like, and she named a few universities that are close to where she lives, that those universities, she knows what their philosophy is, what their paradigm is, how they teach. She can have some sense of expectation of what students coming from those universities will be like. But when she sees a university from a country that she's not familiar with in a context that she doesn't recognize, she doesn't know what to expect. And so when she sees those foreign universities, she's more likely to pass on those resumes, those applications. So an invitation to employers then would be to maybe check out some of those universities. Those universities might actually be the top of the top university in their country. These might be incredibly bright and exceptionally talented candidates that are being turned away just because they come from a place that might not be recognizable. The second item is to recognize the racialized labor that immigrant women or immigrants more generally engage in every day. So a number of immigrants in this study, including both immigrants and refugees, they made a comment around how they felt it was their responsibility to learn to be Canadian, to learn how to navigate the social landscape here. But this labor is actually not recognized. And part of the issue here is when that labor is not recognized and there's no reciprocity, the burden of this task falls on immigrants specifically and solely. And that creates an unfair situation, as we can see from the numbers. Another action item for employers is to allow flexible work arrangements that meet all employee needs. I think the pandemic really made people aware of how much easier it is to balance all the many different responsibilities that any individual might have when you have the flexibility of being able to work in different locations, whether it be at the office or from home, from another remote location. So yes, this recommendation it helped Amina in the story. It would help a number of other employees in diverse different situations as well. In terms of action items for policymakers, something needs to be done to address the disconnect between immigration policies and the labor market. This is actually something that was a finding in the Voices That Matter report as well, an earlier study published by CCMW, that there's a disconnect. So many immigrants are let into this country with these skills, but then these skills seem to not be utilized because they're not recognized. And that needs to be corrected. There's a real loss of human and social capital happening here. A second item is to have consistent social services that are established through, for example, having an established funding base so that they're not temporary services that are offered from time to time. And I mention this because when immigrants come into the country, they tend to have some kind of social network. And so new immigrants coming in will ask older immigrants what services they use, what resources benefited them. The older immigrants might reference programs that no longer exist. Just in this study, there are a number of programs that women were able to use that were really beneficial, but those programs no longer exist. So it's hard to actually include those as solutions or resources that women can turn to. A final item for policymakers is to ensure that the language in policies is used to protect and not police employees. Oftentimes, especially with immigrant women, but across the board with participants, I noticed this tendency for policies to be written in stone when it came to making life easier for certain groups of people, those groups of people or also the ones that are socially marginalized. And yet these policies wouldn't be put into place when it came to privileging people already in positions of privilege. So this double standard in the way that policies are used, and then also the language in the policies themselves, these need to be checked extensively to make sure that existing power structures are not just being recreated and reanimated. Okay, thank you. So moving on to Fatima's story, and we've already introduced Fatima in Amina's story. We'll get to hear a bit more about Fatima now. Fatima is a Canadian-born Muslim woman whose parents immigrated to Canada. Having grown up in Canada since she was born, so she grew up in Canada during the 1990s and then a bit of the early 2000s. And so Fatima has experienced a great deal of anti-Muslim racism. She is deeply motivated to create change for Muslims in Canada. While she was in university, she heard her mother's friends talk about how they had to work 2 times, 3 times, even 4 times as hard as non-Muslim Canadians to get even a fraction of the recognition. So she knows that as a Muslim woman, her work experience will be dismissed. She ends up taking on a number of internships and other work opportunities, packing her schedule so that she can be a more competitive candidate on the job market. But this backfires because when employers see her resume, they don't believe that she's actually done that much. They think that she's lying about her experience, and so they don't call her back. When she tells her racialized friends about her experience, that she's applying to all these positions and not hearing back from anyone, they advise her to change her name because it's too Muslim. So Fatima begins to go by Tima. She's also changing how she wears hijab, incorporating more floral prints or pink colors to appear less threatening because she's aware of how Muslims are socially constructed in the Western gaze. Now, an old professor who she's still in contact with notices that she's still working in these really short-term temporary contracts, but all of her classmates have stable careers. He invites her to lunch and wants to find out what's happening. She feels uncomfortable meeting him because he's a white man, and although they've been in touch and he's always been kind, she's been previously warned by other women of color not to trust white men in power. And so another Muslim student shares her own positive experiences with this specific professor, and Fatima feels a bit more comfortable and she accepts the invitation. She meets him and she discloses her situation to him. And this professor knows someone who's actually looking for a DEI consultant and connects Fatima to the employer who takes her on. On the job, she expects to find a welcoming environment, but quickly realizes that she's entering a fairly hostile situation. And this has to do with workplace hierarchy. Can we switch to the next slide? Thank you. So in the bottom rung of this hierarchy, Muslim women generally feel pretty welcome, pretty comfortable with their colleagues. Where they do experience moments of racism, it's from management or it's from the clients or the public that they're serving or interacting with. But among their colleagues, they feel pretty welcome, pretty safe. I will add that even among this group of women, there were still incidents of discrimination and moments of like racial tension. But for the majority of women, this was a comfortable place for them to be. In the next rung up in the middle section, women overwhelmingly began to report that they could feel something was off. They didn't feel quite welcome. They could feel something, but they couldn't quite put their finger on it. They noticed certain kinds of tension. So for example, they would notice that their white colleagues would get mentored and sort of groomed for going to the next level up, but they would get ignored by management or they would get ignored by potential mentors. The next level up is the most difficult space for Muslim women to be in. Whereas in the middle section, there was a sense of there's some discrimination here. We can't quite put our finger on it, but it's there. In the top rung, it was blatant. There were numerous explicit examples of things that people said that I don't want to repeat them because it would expose the women, but they were quite bizarre. And so Fatima is surprised when she is met with hostility in this upper ring of the workplace hierarchy. Fatima was hired specifically to save the company's face because another employee, who was a DEI manager, had cast public accusations of racism in the company structure. So Fatima's task here is twofold. Not only does she have to support racialized employees and create change within the organization, she has to do this while maintaining a public perception of the company as a racially integrated and inclusive work environment when it's actually not there yet. So she's been co-opted to meet the organization's agenda, and also she has an agenda of her own. She sincerely believes that she can create slow but substantial change within the organization and make it a safer place for racialized employees to work. And in order to do this, she needs to learn how to move through the social politics of the organization, especially in terms of managing the whiteness of the structure. This is a very difficult balancing act. When you're a racialized person and you've been hired by a white-dominated workplace to name racism at that workplace, doing your job well is dangerous. You will get fired if you do your job too well. And so part of the expectation of employers on people of color in these kinds of situations, especially in senior and middle management, is to maintain the whiteness of the organization by managing other people of color. Fatima is not interested in maintaining the white dominant structure of the workplace, even though she's expected to do this. So in order to meet both of these demands, she learns to code switch. Can we move to the next slide? Thank you. Now, code switching can look like some of these other phenomena, but it's not. And I just want to mention that the coconut, the house slave, and the sellout, these were all terms that were volunteered by participants in this study. And that's why I've included them on this slide. There are a host of other terms that could be used as well. I'm highlighting these because they came from the data. Now, when someone code switches, they maintain their internal racial awareness of themselves and of the situation of the other, but they're able to perform whiteness in a way that makes sense to white people. And so it's a form of emotional labor put into communication and presentation in order to make oneself less of a racialized other and more of like a normative Canadian. When someone code switches, they're trying to survive. They aren't internalizing the racism. This is different from the coconut, for example, who is a person of color. They may be like visibly a visible minority, but on the inside, they have internalized so much of racial logic around white supremacy that they have no sense of fighting for or pushing for racial justice. That's sort of just gone away. The house slave is a little bit different. I also just want to explicitly mention that the participant who had mentioned this term is of African descent. So I just want to make that clear. Yesterday was Juneteenth, and we're still living in the echo of the transatlantic slave trade. I would not be comfortable using the word myself, but this was volunteered by someone of African descent, and I want to include it in the study, given that. The house slave is often contrasted with the field slave. So the field slave, if you think back into when slavery was institutionalized in a different form than as we see it today, the house slave tended to be someone who was of a lighter color and bought into the racial hierarchy because they benefited from a bit of proximal whiteness. They were a bit closer to white folk than the field slaves, who tended to be darker in color. And they were given like the brunt of the most difficult work. They were the most aware of the real harm of the racial system. And so in this context, the house slave is someone who is so attached to their proximal whiteness, the benefit that they get from sort of being able to mesh with the white crowd, that they actually betray people of color, similar to the sellout. Now, the sellout is someone who may have started off with having sincere goals in mind for racial justice or racial liberation, but they end up becoming co-opted, or I don't know, I'm just looking or thinking about a number of American politicians that I'm very disappointed by right now who have accepted money from AIPAC. And so the way that they're framing the current issue in Gaza has changed as a result. I look at them as sellouts. Code switching is different from this other phenomena. Again, when someone code switches, they retain their racial awareness and they're performing whiteness in a moment to survive a situation. It's not that they're internalizing it themselves. So although externally, Fatima, or Tima, as she now goes by, she might look like a coconut or a sellout on the outside, but she's actively code switching as she continues to try to make her workplace safe for all employees, regardless of their racial identity. And although Fatima gets a lot of pushback initially, when the numbers start to come in and her higher ups can see that diversity is actually really profitable, they begin to resist her work less. Although they dislike giving up their social privileges, they can see the economic return it comes with. Now, next slide. In terms of barriers and supports that were part of Fatima's experience, just in terms of the barrier, her name and even her appearance being racialized was something that played a role in her difficulty in even finding work. The fact that her work experience was dismissed and questioned was another barrier that she was confronted by. The racial hierarchy at the workplace, and especially the daily experiences of hostility, made it very difficult for Fatima to do her work and continue at what she was doing. However, because of the economic consequences of her work, that starts to shift a bit. I didn't mention parental expectations, and I should just mention that really quickly. Just took time. Okay. So Fatima is second generation. Her parents went to school in their country of origin and tried to find work in the Canadian context. Like other immigrants to Canada, especially immigrant Muslims to Canada, they had a lot of difficulty finding work. And part of their process of coping with this discrimination that they were experiencing was, you know, we're going to work really hard, but at least our children will not have to deal with this. And so when Fatima gets to the age, she's graduated university, she's applying for work, her parents have a lot of expectation on her that she's going to justify the discrimination that they experienced before. Not she specifically, the fact that she's getting work that they can, a job, a position that they can be proud of, that will help to justify the discrimination that they experienced earlier. This is not fair. It's not Fatima's fault that the parents experienced discrimination when they had arrived in Canada and continued to experience discrimination. But the burden of this, the burden of making amends for the experience, is placed on second generation children's shoulders oftentimes. In terms of supports, the real support for Fatima was the mentor, the professor who saw the value in her skills and what she was doing and spoke to his contact on her behalf and really petitioned for her, argued for why she should get hired and why she would make a stellar candidate for this position. Yeah, that's in terms of supports that were available to Fatima. I will mention that in the study, a lot of women in Fatima's experience named education. I didn't include that because of the numbers. Regardless of how educated Canadian Muslim women are, they are as likely to report being unemployed. Like there's no drop in them being unemployed and looking for work, no matter how much additional education they receive. It's 9% across the board. So someone with a post-grad degree is as likely to be unemployed and looking for work as someone who does not have a high school diploma. I just wanted to mention that nuance there. So we'll go on to action items for Fatima and employers and also policymakers on the next slide. Thank you. So for Fatima, one of the action items that is working for her is being able to code switch without becoming a coconut. And this is a very difficult balancing act for her. She has to maintain a lot of self-composure in very difficult situations without internalizing those situations. Fatima is also benefited by having a strong network of a very specific mentor and also other members beyond her specific ethno-religious community. So remember that she was at first hesitant to speak to her mentor because he is a white man. He's not racialized, he's not a woman, and he doesn't understand Muslim experiences, but he could see the value in her. He saw her as a human being, as a person. So the difference in their social identities dissolved because of that human connection. Fatima can also set boundaries with her parents and with employers in terms of the load of expectations that she has placed on her by others. In terms of action items from employers, employers can accept Muslim women's work experience as valid. I mentioned this as one of the employers in the study had mentioned that her workplace intentionally tries to hire people of diverse backgrounds, but when she sees kinds of experience that just they don't add up or it doesn't make sense, she tends to dismiss those applications. I can speak more of this as well, just from my own personal experience. I can share what I've done and like give actual substance to this, but the vast majority of Muslim women that I spoke to in this study have incredibly packed schedules and are doing way more work than non-Muslims that I know of anecdotally. Another action item for employers is to challenge the idea of performativity. So the idea of like hiring people of diverse backgrounds in order to showcase diversity at the workplace, but then maintaining a workplace where there's a racial hierarchy clearly established that continues to benefit whiteness. This is a very performative aspect or a performative way of engaging in DEI practices. It doesn't actually change anything about the workplace. Likewise, another action item is to intentionally offer mentors of diverse backgrounds. And this would be to match people based on different experiences, but to ensure that the mentors see the mentees as human beings, as people with unique and special skill sets to offer. In terms of action items from policymakers, creating a bridging program for diverse talent that's entering the labor market. This comes up in another example, but one of the employers that I spoke to mentioned that they specifically hire diverse talent from bridging programs right from universities. So this is an effective way. Unfortunately, that workplace specifically did not include Muslim women. It's a fairly small organization that is very diverse, but just doesn't include Muslim women. Another action item for policymakers is to provide networking or professional training for new or soon-to-be graduates. And this isn't specifically just for racialized minorities. This could be a Canada-wide initiative to help new graduates and professionals to network and to find community, to find mentors and other folks to help them along the path of finding careers and pursuing those careers. And then support for first-generation university students, regardless of if they are immigrants or not. As a university professor, I can share that students, including Canadian-born students, including students who are third or more generation Canadian, who are entering university for the first time do not have any of the benefit that their peers who have parents who went to university are able to enjoy. So things like just normative expectations that parents have on the children, on their adult children, but then also how to navigate university, how to speak to professors, how to ask for reference letters. These kinds of things, I can see the clear difference between students who have parents that went to university versus students who have parents that did not go to university. And this is a real barrier for students. And then once they enter into the workplace, it becomes exacerbated. Now, moving on to our next story, Hodan is a Somali Canadian Muslim who studied to be an occupational therapist. While in occupational therapy school, she notices a number of Eurocentric practices. So in other words, practices that center white Canadian experiences and seem to ignore the experiences of Canadians of color, for example. She names these practices and she calls out the Eurocentrism. Her professors really appreciate her critical eye and her voice. They recognize the value of including these diverse experiences as the Canadian population continues to increasingly become more diverse. And they encourage her to pursue DEI work, diversity, equity, and inclusion. I just realized I used that term a few times without defining it. My apologies. Hodon agrees. And she has an amazing eye for systems and can so clearly see how institutionalized practices recreate racial hierarchies. She ends up getting hired specifically to do this work. She's initially celebrated because of these keen observations. But like I said before, if you're a racialized employee and you're calling out racism at the workplace, it comes with risks. Hodan experiences what many other racialized women experience, especially Black women. She's seen as a problem for essentially doing her work, the work that she was hired to do. She endures a number of racist experiences at the workplace. So, for example, a colleague discrediting her experience and her education and referring to her as a quota hire, while another colleague asks if they could touch her hair. And there's no way for her to report these incidents because there's no reporting mechanism. She, in her position, she's supposed to handle reporting or like being the recipient of these reports, but she's the one who's actually experiencing these acts of discrimination. She asks a mentor at her work for advice, but this mentor who doesn't really see her, doesn't really empathize with her, who himself, he's a white man and feels threatened by what she's saying, he becomes aggressive towards her. And if you don't know what white fragility is, I do recommend looking that up. Essentially, she's just done with this daily hostility and it's getting worse. And she decides to leave because no one in the organization was willing to dialogue with her and hear what she was saying. She very publicly lists her grievances and shares what the workplace was like as a Black woman. The company doesn't take this seriously at first, but then two major things happen. First, the tragic murder of George Floyd and the mobilization of Black Lives Matter sent shockwaves through social institutions and made white-dominant workplaces begin to self-reflect and begin to shift. Second, because Hodan was very public, outing the company as a fairly racist place to work, meant that other employees, both racialized and not, so white employees, for example, who actually care about working in a racially just workplace environment, they're not applying to work at this company anymore. And senior management is realizing that they have a real issue that they need to confront. And so this is where they take on Fatima to fix this problem for them. I emphasize this because it's important to know that if Hodan did not do what she did, Fatima wouldn't be able to do the work that she's doing. The company treats Fatima better than it treated Hodan because, well, Hodan exposed the truth. And because of that, they have to treat Fatima better. Fatima also has more proximal whiteness, and we can talk about that during the question and answer session. But returning to Hodan's story, it's the truth tellers, those who speak truth to power, that we need to listen to and that we need to support because they allow the rest of us to do the work that we do. After Hodan left the company, she begins to internalize the idea that maybe she is the problem. And then her friend shows her an infographic. Can we switch to the next slide? Thank you. And so on this infographic, it very clearly shows this pattern that not just Hodan, not just Black women, but racialized women more generally experience again and again and again. It's a repeated pattern. And I'll mention that when this infographic was shared during one of the focus group interviews, after the participant dropped it in the chat, there was like an uproar of agreement from every other women in the call that yes, this is the experience that they have either felt themselves or have witnessed personally. So a woman of color enters an organization, there's this moment of sort of being in like this honeymoon phase where the white leadership is really grateful to have this woman of color representing how diverse they are, how inclusive they are, how equitable they are. And then the woman starts to do her work and she names instances of racism and a lack of equity, a lack of inclusion, a lack of diversity. And that doesn't go over too well. Instead of engaging in self-reflection and seeing what's happening at the workplace, they instead point the finger at the woman and problematize her. She's the problem because she's the one who's naming the problem. So if she's naming the problem, she must be the problem. Of course, this is not the case. Neither Hodan nor other women in this situation are the problem. It is the workplace, it is the leaders at these workplaces refusing to do the kind of self-reflection and critical insight that would be necessary to actually shift from being performative allies to actual allies. Now, seeing this infographic and recognizing her experience in this and recognizing that this is a pattern, Hodan realizes also that there's a lot of emotional labor that goes into this kind of work, and she decides to walk away. Instead of trying to integrate into a white dominant workplace where she will be subject to repeated experiences of violence, she networks with other professionals who are either racialized or care about diversity and inclusion, and they apply for a federal grant that allows them to set up a social and health servicing agency. And so they serve racialized and low-income Canadian families. She's back to loving her work again, but this does come at a cost. There isn't much room for vertical advancement because the organization is so small, so there is high employee turnover. Nonetheless, Hodan is able to use the skills she has developed and is able to she's very content working with colleagues who actually respect her and see the value that she brings to the work. So to the next slide. So in terms of barriers and supports that Hodan experienced, specifically the barriers, she was confronted by race-based assumptions, a complete lack of cultural sensitivity at the workplace, and no reporting mechanism. There are also a lack of anti-racist mentors that she can turn to. In terms of supports, she herself is her greatest support in this example, having that entrepreneurial spirit, having that strong resilience, and then being able to draw on her networks to support those goals and to collaborate with others who have similar ideas or similar values. And then having access to a federal grant that enabled launching the community-based initiative was also very important. In terms of action items, if we could go to the next slide. Thank you. So I'll mention that this is true for every Canadian Muslim woman, but this is especially true for Canadian Muslim women who sit at multiple intersections and have that much of a harder time finding or securing good work, to recognize that social issues are not personal failings. The fact that what happened to Hodan happened is not Hodan's fault. Hodan is trapped in a system that undermines her, that dehumanizes her, and that's not her fault. That's not on her. Another action item would be to file grievances when rights are being trespassed in workplace contexts. Even if there's not a reporting mechanism at the workplace, there might be other ways to report the grievance still. So for example, to unions and employment assistance program or other ways as well. A final action item for Hodan is to identify programs that connect Black Canadian graduates to professional opportunities. And I mentioned this earlier that an employer had specifically mentioned using these kinds of programs to find diverse talent. In terms of action items for employers, to recognize the talent and value of each employee, regardless of how well they might fit the image of an employee according to pre-established assumptions around whiteness and maleness, to recognize that Black women, for example, have an incredible perspective to offer to workplaces that, for the most part, in most workplaces, is really missing still to this day. Another action item for employers is to invest into resolution or repair mechanisms after a racial rupture at the workplace that can meet employee concerns. So just as an example, the boundary crossing experience that Hodan had, where an employee wanted to touch her hair, Hodan is not going to feel safe around that employee unless there is actually some kind of repair or resolution that happens between the two of them. Another action for employers is to give employee concerns proper consideration. It takes a lot. It takes a lot for an employee to name a concern or file a grievance or just complain at the workplace, especially when they're in a marginalized position to begin with. So when employees do come forward and name these things, it's really important that employers really listen and take the concern seriously. For policymakers, there should be some kind of workplace reporting mechanism across the board. There are too many Canadian workplaces that do not have a reporting mechanism, and even the ones that do, I'll just mention in this study, I spoke to 95 Canadian Muslim women, and I spoke to or surveyed 50 Canadian employers. There was not one example of a really well-functioning reporting mechanism in existence yet, and that's something that needs to be developed. Responses to victims and perpetrators of workplace discrimination needs to also be considered as well. So how victims of workplace discrimination are treated after an incident happens, and also how the perpetrators are treated as well. Across stories of incidents where women did report experiences to HR managers or to supervisors, often the women would be moved to a different department as if they were the problem, but the person who actually enacted the violence, enacted the workplace discrimination, they got to stay exactly where they were. This can't be a solution. This isn't a solution. A final action item for policymakers is to engage in efforts to really challenge anti-Black racism that include white reflexivity and an opportunity to integrate these learnings. Oftentimes, when we think about DEI, there's so much focus on how racialized others are an other that whiteness is continues to be normalized and not interrogated. Increasingly, scholars of race and racism, I should say more specifically, are indicating that white reflexivity is a really important aspect of challenging racial hierarchies. Okay, so we'll move on to the next story. So like Fatima and Hodan, Nargis also wants to make life better for Muslims in Canada. She's queer, so she's particularly interested in the well-being of queer and transgender Canadian Muslims. She initially wants to be a social worker and work for a queer social service organization. Although still a university student, she's interning at a queer community organization, and she names the fact that, queer and trans Muslim Canadians are not being served. They're actually being very much underserved. So in response, the organization attempts to recognize and include Muslim experiences. But mainstream Muslims in Canada get quite offended by this, and they push back against the very idea of queer Muslim existence. This external critique prevents internal dialogue for both the community organization that's servicing queer Canadians and also the Muslim community. In turn, the organization is less inclined to create Muslim representation or meet their needs, and Muslim organizations also double down on entrenched heterosexism. Now, although this type of incident is a repeated pattern, I'm going to share a highly public example of this scenario that some of you might be familiar with. Can we switch to the next slide? So in the Canadian context, y'all might remember when the University of Waterloo posted this poster, which was meant to celebrate diverse queer and trans Canadians of all different backgrounds, and they included an image of two Muslim women on this poster as well. Around the same time, this Navigating Differences document came out, which essentially rejects the idea that Muslims can be queer. And as a consequence, I mentioned that queer and trans organizations are less inclined to create Muslim representation in their organizations or really to meet the needs of queer Muslims. And so frustrated by this experience, Nargis decides to create change within Canadian Muslim communities. She pursues work at a Canadian Muslim community organization, but unlike Hodan and Fatima, who are visibly racialized, Nargis doesn't have markers that make it obvious that she's queer. In fact, she keeps her sexual orientation quite hidden, as what we sometimes, it's referred to as being in the closet, for example. So because she keeps her identity hidden, she's not able to sort of advance the queer Muslim identity within the organization. And she has to keep that identity hidden because coming out might expose her to violence. She might even lose her job. And she very much wants to keep working at this organization where she has identified a few Muslim youth who are also queer or trans, and she wants to protect them from the kinds of homophobic and transphobic violence that she herself has experienced. While at this organization, Nargis loves her work, but not the kinds of sexism and heterosexism that she encounters. She often hears homophobic or transphobic remarks quite unnecessarily, and she can't share how deeply those comments actually cut at her, they hurt her. She notices also that it's always men that are making decisions, sometimes without even consulting the team, sometimes contrary to what the team decides. And she also notices that even as women are dismissed, not all women are dismissed in the same way. The women who are married to men, they are listened to, but the women who are not married tend to get ignored. When she complains about these issues to the HR manager, the manager makes the team take a gender sensitivity training, but the training is ineffective because people who don't want to listen will find ways to not hear. Now, although Nargis is very uncomfortable with the workplace dynamics, she does have a few close confidants that she knows that know she is queer, and she considers them safe people to turn to when she needs support. She also enjoys the close-knit community of women who makes her feel cared for at the workplace. When Nargis was working at a white dominant organization, she noticed how her white colleagues would get mentored and groomed to climb the structure, but they would often ignore Nargis. So now she's experiencing what it's like to get mentored and cared for, and she also has this opportunity to care and to mentor queer Muslim youth. So despite the sexism and heterosexism at the Muslim organization, she decides to stay. Can we go to the next slide? In terms of barriers and supports that Nargis is experiencing, the sexism and the heterosexism at the workplace are really powerful barriers for her in terms of being able to engage in her work and continue engaging in a way that she feels safe and supported. But in terms of supports, the network of women and having specific allies that she can confide in were supportive. I'm just noticing the time, so I'm going to pick up the pace a little bit. Can we switch to the next slide? So in terms of action items that Nargis employers and policymakers can make, for Nargis, it's really about seeking out communities and making connections with people that can support her and that can protect her from the kinds of violence that she's exposed to, and to also consider career goals that support her own personal well-being. This is something that I noticed. It was not true for all queer Muslims in the study. But in this study and also in the Voices That Matter study, I noticed this trend where queer Muslims were very invested in the Canadian Muslim community, oftentimes at personal expense. In terms of action items employers can make, employers, and this isn't just true for Muslim organizations, this is across the board, that the male dominance in workplace structures needs to be challenged. Also, assumptions that employers make about employees' personal life based on heteronormativity. So this idea that if it's a woman, she must have a male partner who is the breadwinner, for example, or vice versa. If it's a man, he must have a wife who is taking care of the home and children. These kinds of assumptions can actually really cause harm to employees as they try to navigate the workplace and policies. Another action item for employers is to ensure that employees are internalizing DEI trainings. One of the consistent critique around DEI trainings that came up from the study was the fact that the people who need it the most are the ones who don't listen to what's being taught. And so having some form of relational support to ensure that the learnings are actually being internalized would help to create changes and shifts in the workplace. In terms of action items for policymakers is to support community-led interventions in minority populations. So instead of having these external critiques, allowing internal critique that is indigenous to those communities to lead those communities would stop this kind of reactive hardening that we tend to see. So for example, critiquing Muslims for being homophobic will in turn cause a double down on that homophobic rhetoric. Another action item is to have thoughtful engagement with Canadians who live at multiple intersections. And also, I mentioned the relational support to ensure DEI efforts are actually being integrated and internalized to be effective. We're going to turn to the last story of Tenzil, a single mother. So Tenzil was married, but her husband was not supportive. In fact, he tried to sabotage her career repeatedly. And once she began to earn more than him, he escalated the mistreatment. And so for the sake of her children, she decided to leave him and to obtain a divorce. Unfortunately, because she out-earns him and they have joint custody, she has to pay her ex-husband spousal and child support. And so this means that she doesn't have much left over for childcare after paying out these forms of support. Tenzil's mother moves in to help Tenzil, and this is an incredible support, especially when her children are young. As the children get older, the demands of intensive childcare become less, but Tenzil cannot catch a break. Her mother gets sick. And so Tenzil is now solely responsible for caring for both her children and her mother. This is what's called the sandwich generation. Can we switch to the next slide? So individuals who care for both the next generation and also the previous generation, these folks are in the sandwich generation. Tenzil works at the same organization as Fatima and Amina. In fact, Amina actually is Tenzil's supervisor. Tenzil tells Amina about the difficulty with work and how expensive childcare is and how transportation is now an issue because she can't afford to keep a car. And Amina tells Tenzil to pursue further education so that she can climb up to middle management and would have better benefits and more pay to take care of her family. But Tenzil doesn't feel Amina sees her reality. Tenzil doesn't have the financial means to pursue higher education, and the benefits that come with a better position could cover costs related to her children, but they don't cover her mother. And so for Tenzil, it's not worth it. Another difference that neither Tenzil or Amina recognize is how their marriage impacts their experiences and their motivation to work. Amina has a very supportive spouse, and he goes out of his way to make sure that Amina's life at home is comfortable after she comes home from a hard day of work. Tenzil has the opposite experience and had her self-esteem chipped away day after day for years. So Amina has a very strong sense of mastery. She believes she can. Tenzil does not. And so both internal and external barriers prevent her from moving up in the organization and securing the kind of work that would enable her to have a fulfilling balance between work and family responsibilities. I'm just aware that there are quite a few questions and we are getting close to our time. Maybe we can go over just a few minutes. So yeah, thank you. In terms of the barriers that Tenzil is confronted by, not having affordable or adequate childcare, having issues with transportation, the mass transit in her city is abysmal, not having financial support for continuing her education, and then also ensuring that the benefits extend to all family members. These are all barriers, the possible supports if they were to be addressed that would enable Tenzil to continue working. The supports that Tenzil does have include having a family, so her mother, especially for childcare, and then having male relatives that help out with transportation. So her father and cousins offer to drive her to and from work. The fact that she has an understanding supervisor, Amina, and that the workplace that she is in feels like it's it's employee-centered because of Amina. She also has a sense of belonging with her colleagues at the workplace. In terms of action items that Tanzil and employers and policymakers can engage in, Tanzil can consider the advice of mentors and consider opportunities for advancement, though I note that this is difficult to do when the motivation has been dimmed down as much as what Tanzil has experienced. Tanzil can also network and identify workplaces that prioritize employee well-being. She does have that now with Amina. But previous to this, it was a challenge for her to find a workplace that actually cared about people and instead would prioritize productivity or policies. Tanzil can also negotiate for remote work opportunities as a way of addressing the dearth of care and also the challenges around transportation. Action items employers can engage in is to offer time flexibility to support employees meeting diverse needs, to have very defined roles and responsibilities, and a way for employees to easily identify and contribute to the organization, and having a decompression space for employee well-being as well. Policymakers can identify the benefits, extend the benefits that are needed to support changing family forms, because that standard nuclear family is a thing of the past. We have very diverse family forms in Canada today, but these family forms are not supported by the current structure of the way that benefits are provided. Likewise, policies that center single parents as employees would help to create a universal design. I actually want to thank one of the participants in this study who introduced this idea. This person is in charge or has a leadership position at a Canadian Muslim community organization and volunteered the idea that we should start design of workplaces around single parents. And when I asked why that was the case, the employer mentioned that, well, single parents have the most intense barriers. All the barriers, all the obstacles that I mentioned for the other women, Tanzil experiences as well. And Tanzil experiences those barriers as a single mother, which makes it all the more difficult for her to overcome those barriers. So starting as a starting point, starting with Tanzil's experience and identifying the needs, the resources that are missing, the supports that can enable people in those situations to work would in effect actually benefit everyone else that would also experience types of barriers related to these. Another action item for policymakers is to reduce the financial barriers to training and advancement opportunities. There's a number of universities in Europe, for example, that do not charge tuition for students to study. And I don't know why in North America we maintain a very corporate approach to universities. I hope that changes, and I hope that eventually we can find ways to break the corporate nature of university settings, which are detracting from the education of students, and reinvest into students themselves. Until that happens, some kind of access to financial resources to help people in Tanzil's situation, or just people who have trouble with finding the financial means to pursue education would be a real support. Moving on to the next slide. Now, across the 5 stories of Canadian Muslim women, I've demonstrated how each woman experiences a specific set of barriers and uses different kinds of resources as they navigate the workplace. I've also shared how their stories are interconnected. If we could switch to the next slide. And how their experiences relate to each other as members of this workplace hierarchy. If there's one takeaway from this study, I want to emphasize how important workplace hierarchy is. Any aspect of Canadian Muslim women's employment experiences and outcomes can be explained using this lens. Some Canadian Muslim women found ways to creatively navigate the oppressiveness of this structure, but I think it's important to recognize, even as some Muslim women were able to squeeze through and climb up the ranks, this structure is set up to keep Muslim women down in that bottom rung. A Muslim woman participant shared her reflections on why this is such an issue and why we need to name it. And I provided that quote on the next slide. Eventually, we'll be able to liberate ourselves from this systemic abuse. If you graduate from university and you can't get a job because of your name, if you are qualified and you have to start over because you wear a hijab on your head, This is abuse. This is financial abuse. This is exploitation. This is social abuse. And it's really important for us to learn to name these things. Okay. Thank you everyone for listening to the stories of Canadian Muslim women. I'd be happy to take questions. I note that the stories that I shared focus on the experience of Muslim women who speak English. As was mentioned earlier, there were a number of other languages that were also included in the study. So women who speak Arabic, Bangla, Persian, including both Farsi and Dari, Pashto, Somali, Urdu, and French. So if folks have questions about those women's experiences as well, I'd be happy to answer to those questions. I just want to highlight that I wasn't in the focus groups, and so some questions I might actually defer to our research assistants that were able to directly communicate with those women.
Thank you, Sarah. And just before we begin our Q&As, I see such rich discussions in the chat. So just introducing myself as Firdaus, as the project manager with the project, and really wanting to thank Sarah for doing such an amazing job. And just the way she presented, using the narrative style is really important. And I want to also just add two quick things is that, as we undertook this study, it was really, really important for us to kind of be inclusive. So the study is inclusive of Black Muslim women, gender diverse women who are living with diverse abilities. So we've tried our best to make it as inclusive so that it speaks to all. And as I was reading Sarah's report, I myself found myself in so many places. I was Fatima, I was Amna, I was so many more. And I see that is being reiterated in the chat as well to say many South Asians, many racialized Muslim women are really facing these similar issues. And sadly, that study that was done 20 years ago, while our numbers have grown, really our space in the equity place has not. We've kind of remained in that bottom rung. I've been on the top, the middle, and the bottom, and really those barriers have amplified in many ways. So I thank you, Sarah, for taking on such a challenging study. And I know that we are short of time, but I just want to quickly add that, the richest part of this study is really the qualitative data. So the quantitative data is definitely there. The evidence is there, but those rich stories are there for you to explore and to engage on. And something I read this morning really again resonated with me to say that your story, your lived experience could be someone else's survival guide. So that is really, really so important for us to know that something that we are facing, we can prevent it from happening if we simply share it and we work together towards systemic change. So before I open up the Q&As, I do know that we are stressed for time, so we may have just 10 minutes, but I just want to add that anything that does not get accomplished today, any questions, please reach out to me. We have a slide with my contact information. I will forward the query to Sarah if needed, if it is study related, or try my best to answer it. But this is just the beginning, right? Like I just want to say that the study is really that start point from where a lot of wonderful things will happen, inshallah. And hopefully we have study toolkits, we have strategies, we have an employment conference. So all good things coming. Watch out the CCMW space. This recording will also be added to our website. So Nuzhat, going over quickly to you, I think you had something to add before we open to the Q&As, and just recognizing that time is short.
Yeah, just a very quick comment about this work. So Sarah, congratulations on an amazing piece of work. I just want to remind everybody that we started on this journey 20 years ago with the first report that Dawood Hamdani had done. He gave us a lot of good quantitative data, a lot of different types of analyses. But what made this work come alive, was your intersectional approach and the storytelling, the lived experiences that you shared, and how, we're connected, we're related to, to our experiences. And I really like that, the way you linked the women, their connectedness, and how they were able to support, advance, help each other. And really, I like that model simply because it's not just about identifying problems, but also solving them and doing it together. So thank you. And I'm thrilled, to see the evolution. Not that much has changed, but the way we look at these problems really has changed, from the way Dawood had done it. He did it for CCMW, and we called, the report Muslim Women Beyond Perceptions, and the perceptions were to break down stereotypes about Muslim women, not being educated, not having language skills, not having experience. All those myths were busted then. But today, what you've done is to show the resourcefulness of the women and how they got through life and their employment barriers. So thank you so much. Really appreciated it.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Nazat, as well. I just have one quick question. I think it asked whether we included women who are wearing the niqab in the study. That was one of the questions. And if you can open up the Q&A. So anybody who has a question, please add it to the Q&A so that we can quickly answer it. I've also put my email there for anything that does not get responded to today.
Thank you so much for this. And I just want to mention that I am humbled by like this was not just like my own effort. I have to say that without the research assistants and also the Canadian Muslim women and the employers themselves who participated in the study, they made this study possible. And I'm very, very thankful to them. For those, just before I get to your question, I'm going to respond to Brenda. The employers were not at all reluctant to share information. The employers who participated in the study, and this is a bit of a selection factor as well, they were very invested in the well-being of their employees. They sincerely care for the well-being of their employees, and they were very enthusiastic to participate in this study. In terms of the participation of Muslim women who wear diverse kinds of coverings, hijab was named repeatedly as a barrier, both by hijabis and also non-hijabis who at one time wore hijab or were familiar of the experiences of their Muslim sisters or friends who are muhajibin. I'm not aware of anyone who participated in the study wearing niqab. This might be a consequence of the fact that the focus groups were mainly of women. Sorry, not just mainly. The focus groups included women. And so if they were hijabi, they oftentimes did not cover because of the comfort of being among others who also were not covering. I didn't explicitly ask if anyone wore niqab or not. So I'm inclined to say no. However, it's possible that a niqabi did participate, but just did not identify herself as such.
That's great. Thank you, Sarah. And again, I just see a logistical question. So yes, the launch recording is going to be added. If you have any queries for Sarah pertinent to the study itself, send me that email. I will forward it to Sarah. But I'm not, Iman and Sulekha, if you can help me, is there any other question that you see that is related to the study and the presentation today? Please read it out.
Someone asked, can you briefly define what white fragility means?
Yeah, so it's not just whiteness. I want to mention that as well. So if you think about how someone who benefits from white privilege reacts when that race-based privilege is named, how men might react when you name male privilege, how Muslims in mainstream Muslim spaces might react when you name straight Muslim privilege. It's this kind of volatility, this kind of aggressive response that comes out in order to protect one's own form of privilege. White fragility is actually a term that was coined. I shouldn't say coined. I know that Michael D'Angelo has a book titled White Fragility. I want to say it's a term that he constructed, but I might not be 100% on that. Kimia or Amal, if you know, feel free to volunteer that information. But so in this book, White Fragility, he actually outlines how individuals might claim to be anti-racist, even to be allies of racial minorities, but then when they're actually held to account, when they're questioned, when they're asked to demonstrate, like, how are you mobilizing your race-based privilege in order to create racial justice, they react very badly to that question. Their white fragility is exposed in those moments.
Great, thank you, Sarah. We have 3 questions, so I'll read them out quickly. So one from Zoha is there any data on the employment of Muslim women in male-dominated fields such as engineering versus traditionally female-dominated ones such as teaching?
Yes, yes. So in the report, there's a section that's titled Areas of Study, and I recommend checking that out. Ironically, Muslim women in STEM careers actually had a higher rate of employment and lower rates of unemployment and looking for work compared to Muslim women who were looking in careers that are sort of framed or gendered as being feminine. So social sciences, the humanities, arts and science, or the arts, I should say, they experience much higher rates of unemployment and lower rates of employment compared to the general Canadian population.
That's great. Thank you. We have another question which is quite detailed, but I'll just read it. That it says that, you know, the acronym ASPIRE is a little confusing, and it kind of aligns with some other service that exists. So just to answer that, Project ASPIRE was an acronym that Nuzat coined for us because the project name was so long. And so really it helped us as we kind of worked with different moving pieces. So, you know, it's kind of basically in a shell addressing systemic inequities and problems around employment issues. So really sorry for that confusion, but we've been using that acronym for our study. But now you have a full name for the study. So I'm hoping we can use that as well. So hoping that answers the question. And there's another question which says, you mentioned recommending diverse mentors for your organization. With relation to the story, was the takeaway that mentors should be of the same background, or would you say that you know, they should have different experiences and should be exposed to diverse experiences as well?
So I would say both of those experiences are important. Having mentors who share your social experience and also mentors who do not. Both of these kinds of mentors are important to have in your networks. I want to mention, it seemed as if for many women, there is this assumption of only having one mentor. I'm not sure where that comes from. That's actually, it can harm you more than help you if you only rely on one mentor. So just in terms of advice for setting up networks, make sure that you have as many mentors of diverse backgrounds as possible. The value of having a mentor who shares a social experience with you is that they will be able to understand your experience without you having to name it, and can also identify skills or strengths that you might have that you're not recognizing as strengths or skills. The benefit of having someone of a diverse background is that they will have experiences that you don't necessarily have access to, and you can actually experience that vicariously. I'll mention I have mentors of who look like me, and then I also have mentors of various different backgrounds. And I note the type of privilege that I'm able to experience through this kind of proximal whiteness of having white mentors. It does benefit me. As long as your mentors are able to see you as actual human beings who respect you, who see your value, that's what matters. If you have a mentor who's undermining you or doesn't quite take you seriously, drop that person. That person is not, they're not going to be able to benefit you because they don't actually see you.
That's great. Thank you, Sarah. And two last questions before we wind up. One is logistical. So yes, the report is on our website. It is a long report. It's 100 pages plus. So definitely will need your time, for the review. But we will also be adding an executive summary of the report by tomorrow, again on our website. That may help. So if there is any other things that you need to take this study forward within and outside your organizations, again, please reach out and we will try our best to send you any resources that we do have. I know that we are developing more and more infographics, trying to make the study more engaging so that you can take it on to the next level. So definitely will help with that. And one comment that I'm reading is from Freshta, who wanted to actually speak, but she says she's 19, studied for 1 year in the engineering program at the Herat State University, has great passion for education and work, want to continue studies and enter the job market. But if universities had not been closed by the government, I would now be in my 4th year and about to graduate. Unfortunately, this did not happen, and I have a deep interest in my field of studies. So basically, she's just saying, I'm asking your help for me to get out of this backward society. I do not want to stay here. Even my thoughts are more aligned with Western ideology. So Sarah, anything that you can suggest at this point?
That's a very complex issue. So Nadia has a question that might relate to the experience of Farisha that you just mentioned as well.
Yeah. So Nadia says, thank you for the presentation. I was wondering if you found any indication of changes to the way Muslim women were treated in employment spaces based on social or political phenomena. Example, the London terrorist attack on Afzal family, the ongoing genocide in Gaza, terrorist attack, niqab bans, etc. Really important, yes.
Yeah, so thank you, Nadia and Farishta. I'm going to respond to both of you together. So Nadia, because of when the study was conducted, the data was collected starting in the summer of 2023 and up until early 2024. The data from Muslim women specifically was primarily collected before October 7th. Employers, that data was collected after October 7th. So unfortunately, I wasn't able to hear Muslim women's experiences in relation to what's going on in Gaza right now because the data was collected too early for that. In terms of the social impact of these events, these were actually not named by employers, unfortunately. However, the murder of George Floyd was named repeatedly by employers as a moment of becoming like activated in terms of racial awareness and engaging in reflexivity and changing the structure of workplaces. So the impact of that and whether it impacts the outcomes for Canadian Muslim women, those are things that we have to wait to see. And so Farishta, to your question, I know things are really bad right now. And I hear you, there were a number of people, people who participated in the study, and then also people I spoke to in the field as I was collecting data for this study, who mentioned that, you know, if I knew Canada was this bad, I would never have come. Like, I want to go back home. And I hear that, and I very much, like, I can relate to that myself. And at the same time, also, we need hope that things will change and things will get better. And it's through doing this kind of work, through having these kinds of conversations, that we're going to be able to push things in a way that will be beneficial, not just for Canadian Muslim women, but for Canadians more generally as well. I do believe that we are working towards, and we will have a future where every human being is seen as a human being and is not restricted because of the color of their skin or their gender identity or the God that they worship. That we can just share space and just be human together. So first, to hang in there. We're going to do this together.
Can I just say something to Farishta? Farishta, I know that I guess you're joining us from Afghanistan. So I just want to say to you that there are supports available. I would encourage you to contact the Afghan Women's Organization, AWO. They have lots of guidance for women who may want to migrate to Canada or find ways to do it. And there are those who are offering education to women in Afghanistan, even today, through online means. So please do contact the Afghan Women's Organization, AWO, here in Canada. I hope that you can reach them and they're going to be able to help you in some way or another. Thanks for contacting us.
Thank you, Nuzat. I've put the link in the chat for their website, and hopefully you can reach out, Farishta, to them. And so with that, I kind of conclude the Q&A session. And again, we are not closing the calls. If there is some really urgent questions or queries, do reach out to myself. I've put my email in the chat, or info@ccmw.com, and we will forward it to the right person. Really thanking all of you for being there today. And I just want to hand it over to our amazing board chair, board president, Nina Karachi Khalid. Nina has always been such a huge supporter of all the work that we do, to the staff, to ally board members, to our chapter presidents and other members. So Nina, over to you for closing remarks. Thank you.
Thanks, Firdaus. Assalamu alaikum, everyone. On behalf of the Canadian Council of Muslim Women, I want to begin by thanking God for all our blessings, for being able to join together, to study, to learn from one another. This sisterhood and community is so precious, and now more than ever, it is a source of solace and support. Project Aspire is led by our amazing Firdaus Ali. She never fails to amaze me with all that she can accomplish. Firdaus has assembled a wonderful research team led by Sarah Shaw. Professor Shaw, we're so grateful to her. She has lent her experience to us in the past, and she's a dear friend of CCMW. We also want to thank all of the Muslim women participants, the employers who participated in the study, the project team, the interpreters, the project advisory members, and the research assistants who facilitated the research groups. We hope this research will add to the knowledge base of Canadian Muslim women and their lived experiences, and hopefully further studies will expand the findings and help all women to engage and thrive in Canadian society, especially in their fields of employment. Please get engaged with this study and share it with your organizations and key influencers in your local regions. Please access the report at our website, www.ccmw.com, for the report, graphics, and press releases. Thanks to all of our friends who have joined this presentation today. CCMW is supported and strengthened by your engagement. May God bless you all and protect you and help you to make a positive difference in your family and your community at large. Take care. Assalamu alaikum. Thanks again.